I feel like in some sort of a very cruel reality show. Who's gonna be next? Who's gonna Hamas execute next? Who's the next family who's gonna break down and stop counting the days?
I'm Venetia Rainey, and this is Battle Lines. It's Friday, October 4th.
We cannot allow ourselves to become numb to the suffering, and I will not be silent.
President Zelensky has for the first time acknowledged that his forces are conducting a cross-border offensive inside Russia.
I just find bombs and I find dead people, but it's a really scary thing for me.
Today we're bringing you a special episode focusing on Hamas's October the 7th massacre and its consequences for Israelis. I want to address that directly. This episode will only be looking at the Israeli perspective. Hamas murdered almost 1,200 people and kidnapped 250 men, women and children when they invaded southern Israel in the early hours of October 7th, 2023. The terror group's bloody rampage included rape, mutilating bodies and looting. Be'eri, Kfar Aza, Nir Oz, Nova Music Festival. These are just some of the sites of October the 7th's atrocities that are now seared on our minds forever. The horrors of that day have been well documented, and we won't be reliving them here. I want to instead focus on what has come since for Israelis as they grapple with the fallout. We'll be hearing from the relative of a family who were kidnapped by Hamas and are still being held hostage today. A former IDF soldier turned peacenik who's helping to gather accounts from officers about the reality of Israel's war in Gaza, and a journalist who's covered the last year of the conflict for the Telegraph. Three people with very different views who'll tell their own stories and give their own interpretations of how that awful day continues to echo throughout Israel. Of course, the fallout from October 7th was not just devastating for Israel. More than 40,000 Gazans have been killed during the ensuing war, including at least 11,000 children, according to a recent conservative estimate. Untold suffering continues to be unleashed on Gaza every day, and the war has now spread to the West Bank, Lebanon, and beyond. We'll continue to cover all of that here on Battle Lines, but to mark October 7th, we wanted to hear from Israeli voices about their stories. The first person you'll hear from is Jotam Confino. Born in Israel but raised in Denmark, Jotam moved back to Israel in 2018 to work as a journalist. He was in Tel Aviv and woke up with the rest of the country to sirens and the boom of rockets. Since then, he's been reporting for the Telegraph on the military campaign in Gaza, schisms in Netanyahu's war cabinet, and the plight of displaced people from northern Israel. I started by asking him what the mood was like in the days and weeks after October 7th.
I think the first word that comes to mind is chaos, simply because nobody really knew what was happening. There was very little information coming from the government in the first couple of hours on October the 7th, and the streets were virtually empty. So it was a surreal experience to be in Tel Aviv, which is a buzzing city, and to see either people running for shelter or just nobody on the street. And everyone was trying to figure out what was happening. There was a lot of panic because there were also obviously rumors about terrorists who had even reached Tel Aviv. So it was a bunch of misinformation and, of course, also reliable information, but chaos, panic, and anger and fear. It was many things all at once. It was incredible to live it and to experience it.
What was it like reporting on the attack? As you mentioned, lots of misinformation, lots of different stories and rumours, and obviously such high emotion. And I imagine as well, the Israeli military censors would have been working on everything that you produce. Was it difficult to sort of get to the facts and to report objectively as well when emotions were running so high for journalists as well as everyone else, I imagine?
So I would say because I'm a foreign journalist, I'm not under the same military censorship as the Israeli reporters, for example. And because we were inside Israel and everything was very chaotic, we were allowed to go and do our reporting. The military couldn't really control us. So actually, the day after, I left Tel Aviv and I went south to try and figure out what was going on the ground, to see what was happening. And the entire area along the Gaza border was closed off. It was one big military zone, and the zone that was adjacent to that was filled with reporters, police, and ambulances. So, of course, it was extremely difficult to get information, but because there were so many victims, there were so many people that spoke about what they had experienced, in that sense, it was relatively easy to get a picture drawn of what actually happened on October the 7th. But because there were also, it was very early days, and the military and the medics and all of those people that were supposed to give us information were also in an incredibly chaotic situation. So, of course, there were stories that came out that turned out to be outright false. There was a story about 40 beheaded babies, which I myself told my editor at the time not to report because I thought it sounded unreliable and I didn't trust the source. But it was very difficult, mainly because we relied a lot on, of course, social media, videos, footage from social media. And then we had to speak to people who had just survived a massacre, which was horrendous. People were still in shock and traumatized.
How have Israelis and Israel as a nation been processing that trauma? It is such a huge thing for a relatively small country, really, to have experienced. What has that been like?
I would say we haven't dealt with it yet. It's not even gone to post trauma. It is an ongoing trauma. And the reason why I'm saying that is because the war is not over and there are still hostages held in Gaza. And for all Israelis, I would say most Israelis at least, that's something that you think about. Even if it's not your family or your friends that are held in Gaza, you cannot avoid, first of all, being reminded about those people who are held in tunnels or wherever they are in Gaza, but also you see it all the time because if you're watching the news, you will hear relatives of the hostages speaking about this. So this is an ongoing trauma. And as somebody said the other day in the studio, we haven't even reached post-trauma yet. And I very much agree with that.
We'll be speaking to Yifat Zailer, the cousin of Shiri Bibas, who was kidnapped along with her family and her 2 young children, later in this episode. What changes have you noticed in Israel since October the 7th? It happened at a sort of funny time because last summer there were huge protests against Netanyahu's government for trying to push through changes to the judiciary that protesters felt were compromising the judiciary's independence. He was not popular. How has the sort of political landscape shifted in Israel since October 7th?
It's a good question because Netanyahu was incredibly unpopular before October the 7th, and naturally, presiding over the biggest disaster in Israel's history as the prime minister, he only reached a lower level of popularity. And it was interesting to see how he dealt with it because most Israelis, all they really wanted was for him to take responsibility, to be a statesman and to say, it happened on my watch. I'm sorry. But he could not bring himself to do that. And that caused immense anger and rage while people were still trying to figure out what actually happened on October the 7th. So it completely destroyed Israel's political map. It didn't break Netanyahu's coalition, but his numbers plummeted. His entire coalition lost about 20 seats or so, which is unprecedented, really. But since then, there's been a journey. And I would say where we are right now, Netanyahu has somehow managed to regain some of his popularity. He's still not a popular figure. He's very divisive. But because Israel is fighting on 7 different fronts and it's currently being attacked on a daily basis by Hezbollah and now also Iran with ballistic missiles, Israelis have somehow accepted that this is the situation. There's a government that's not about to fall, and they need to at least support the mission. And the mission is to defeat Israel's enemies. So I would say it's been an incredible journey to watch going from rage, frustration, sadness, and now to this sort of unity, at least when it comes to fighting Israel's enemies.
And what about the right-wing aspect of Israeli politics? Obviously, Itamar Ben-Gvir, Bezalel Smotrich in the cabinet, but we also have heard increasingly over the last year about Israeli settlers trying to block aid from going into Gaza, harassing Palestinians in the West Bank. Has that movement or that strand of Israeli political thought, and I guess Israeli of Israeli society, has that been emboldened since October 7th in the sort of spirit of revenge for Hamas's atrocities?
Yes, I think we're seeing something very similar to what happened in the Second Intifada in the beginning of the 2000s, where a string of suicide attacks all across Israel simply shifted Israel's political map to the right. Israelis became more right wing, and I think that this is the same we're seeing now. When Israelis experience terrorist attacks, it does not want them to make peace with the Palestinians. And this is one of the flaws in the strategy of the Palestinians, because nobody can deny them their need and their longing for having a state. But if they think that attacking Israel will somehow bring that about, they're very wrong, because the left wing in Israel is almost dead. I can point to maybe one political or two political parties that would be considered left wing, but they're so marginal and they don't really have an influence. And when Netanyahu falls one day, the next government will not be a broad coalition like we saw 2 years ago with left wing parties, Arab parties, right wing parties. It will be classic right wing from top to bottom. So, yes, we're seeing an increasing shift towards right wing politics in Israel.
And just finally, what's it been like for you as you said you consider yourself 80% Danish, 20% Israeli. What's it been like for you as a sort of partial foreigner coming into Israeli society and living through this quite extraordinary moment in the country's history? What have you observed?
I've observed that first of all, I learned a lot, not only as a human being, but as a journalist. And the many things that I thought were myths that Israelis told me over the years, that most people hate Israelis and the UN is biased against Israelis, things that I always dismissed as just paranoia. I'm finally beginning to see that there's actually something about this. And the reason why I'm saying that is because I myself have been subject to a horrendous campaign in the country where I live to get me off air, mainly due to my Israeli background, because I'm a quote unquote Zionist. And that's been extremely uncomfortable to experience. But I'm not the only one. I see plenty of other half Israeli reporters or Jewish reporters who are exposed to the most vile campaigns and anti Semitism. And it's really difficult to navigate in it and not to lose your temper. So I've learned a lot. I've learned that the Israeli people are very unpopular in the world. It's a fact. And their frustration is understandable. That being said, there are many flaws inside Israel that you can rightly criticize. But the past year, I've been quite astonished to see the level of anger from parts of the world that have nothing to do with this region be so hateful towards a country like Israel.
Has it changed your sense of identity living through this last year?
Yes, it has. I still consider myself 80% Danish, mainly because I grew up there and that's my mother tongue. And my family lives there. Most of my family lives there. But of course, being here and being half Israeli, at least on the paper, it makes you feel like whether you want it or not, you belong to certain people because everyone else thinks that you do. You are, by definition, Israeli, so you might as well embrace it. And I have, because there are many things I really like about this culture. There are many things I really don't like, but many things that I embrace, and especially the resilience that I think that Israelis have shown the past year is something that I have admired and something I've tried to learn from.
And finally, do you feel hopeful for Israel, given everything that's happened, particularly over the last 2 weeks with, the now expanded war into Lebanon, Iran's attack on Israel recently? Do you feel, what do you feel about Israel's future in the short to medium term or the long term?
I think in the long term, it will be incredibly hard. There will be many people lost lives, civilians mostly, in Lebanon, in Israel, in Gaza, in Iran, probably, also in Syria, probably Yemen. But I do think that we're at a breaking point in the Middle East. And I do try to at least believe that we are changing something for the better. Israel is not flawless in any way possible, but there is a certain alliance of terror groups that have terrorized not just Israel, but millions of civilians across the Middle East for decades. And I believe that chain is about to break now. So I hope in the long term, there can be a change in the Middle East where people can just accept to live next to each other without wanting to go to war every 5 or 10 years, because it's not sustainable, really, for anyone.
Thank you so much for joining us. That's Jotam Confino in Tel Aviv. The second person you'll hear from is Yifat Zailer. Her cousin Shiri Bibas was filmed being kidnapped on October 7th, along with her family, husband Yarden, plus sons Ariel and baby Kfir, then 4 years old and 9 months old, both now famous for their fiery red hair and for being the youngest of the Hamas hostages. Last November, Hamas claimed all 3 had been killed and released a disturbing video of Yarden reacting to their claims. Their deaths, however, have not been officially confirmed, and Yifat continues to fight for the family's return. Speaking to my colleague Lauren Libert, she explained the story behind that cruel video and why she hasn't lost hope yet.
The hostages who were released in the last ceasefire told us immediately, the ones who were with him in captivity, about his situation, about his conditions, and about the moment that Hamas asked him to video that horrible video of him that was released. They were there. They were sitting there in the corner. The terrorist asked the other hostages to tell him in Hebrew what has happened and to video that. And that's the only sign of life that we have. And that's also from November. So I can only hope that he is okay. Thinking about him in captivity, a father who went outside of the safe room to save his wife and children from terrorists. He thought that he will be taken first and they will leave them behind. So for the first time, hearing that they were actually taken and that they were killed, allegedly killed, and then spending almost a year in captivity, he doesn't receive the information that us as family here receive when the intelligence and other people involved are telling us that there's no confirmation. I wish I could tell him that. For him, it's the truth. For him, they took him the right to mourn. He doesn't know yet what we know, that there's still a chance, there's still hope. I'm not giving up. I'm the last one who should give up. They say hope dies last, and I'm not gonna give up my hope to see them again. And rumors there all the time. We receive online, on Instagram, on Facebook, messages, people who send us asking for money if we want information about them. It's torture. It's non-stop. It's a roller coaster. On Telegram, there are messages all the time, that someone found a clothing item that belongs to them. And the army officials, the IDF, the intelligence, they say immediately that's not true, that's only rumors. I always try to talk about them in present tense. It's really hard as the time goes by. She knows, my eldest, Daniela, she knows that she connects the dots. She doesn't really understand because she's only 3, but she said, but when you walk here in the street, there are photos everywhere. So we're driving in the car and she's pointing, here is Ariel, here's Auntie Shiri. I saw a photo of Kfir today. I try to smile and say yes, that people are waiting for them, that they will return. Try not to frighten her too much, but I'm lying because I'm terrified as well. I'm terrified now as a mother here in Israel of 2 to be kidnapped tomorrow morning. It's like it's been a roller coaster. A lot of moments of hope that I'm gonna see my loved ones again, and then moments of despair and great sadness when hearing about other hostages being killed. I lost my aunt and uncle on October 7, and next month it will mark, a year since that day. And I never started mourning and saying goodbye, even because I'm so invested in trying to see what more I can do, what more can we do as family to raise awareness of our story about Shiri, Yarden, Kfir and Ariel. To say that I'm tired is the obvious. I'm exhausted. I'm terrified. I can't believe that it's been 11 months now. I really can't believe it. The 6 hostages that were killed and shot in the head and returned for burial. They're not my family, but by now, all the hostages, I feel like they're and all their families. We are one big family here. And receiving that news, I broke down completely. They should have been safe. They should have been home. I'm terrified for my family's faith and if they're alive and if they're not, we don't know anything. And the not knowing is also, I feel like in some sort of a very cruel reality show. Who's gonna be next? Who's gonna Hamas execute next? Who's the next family is gonna break down and stop counting the days since they're gone? It's been really hard because of the months that has passed and the war, the ongoing war, to raise awareness of our family and the story of what happened and the fact that they are still there. Not a lot of people want to listen to that anymore. I just feel very alone. And I'm trying to remind here as well at home and whomever is listening around the world that my cousin, her husband, and their 2 children are human beings as well. And they deserve freedom. Never in my life. It's been so long since I talked to my cousin, 11 months, almost a year without speaking is something that is very unfamiliar for me. She's my youngest. She's my youngest cousin. We are only 4. I have a younger brother and Shiri has an older sister, but I'm the oldest. So I think since childhood I've been somewhat of a, trying to protect them, both of them, Shiri and her sister, and my brother as the responsible one, as the elder one. And I feel like I'm failing. I wasn't there to protect her on October 7th. And I'm failing in trying to bring her back home. And I miss her terribly. I truly believe that from the outside, it's really difficult to understand the whole story. And when you dig in and when you learn and when you read the 2 sides of the book, then you realize, okay, there are more to it. I know that some people, they don't really understand what they are shouting when they say from the river to the sea or anger. I have a lot of anger in me. I have a lot of anger towards Hamas, the cruelty. I know a little bit about Islam. I have a lot of Muslim friends. I know what happened on October 7th has nothing to do with Islam. All the rules of the Islam, it's not in the Quran. I know it has nothing to do with freeing Palestine as well. You don't kidnap babies and wash it in this headline of this is the resistance. You don't justify it like that. You don't burn alive a 63-year-old lady who has Parkinson's, my aunt. You don't kill a 67-year-old painter unarmed. I have a lot of anger. And of course, I have a lot of anger towards my government as well. I have to remain hopeful that some miracle will happen and I'll see my cousin running towards us with her 2 baby boys and we'll make this nightmare all go away. And I'll hope I'll get to see that family reunited. Yarden holding his 2 beautiful boys and his love of his life, my cousin, Shiri. I promised her sister that I'll do everything I can. It's hard to remain hopeful. But it's the only thing that helps me get out of bed every day. That little hope.
To hear more stories like Yifat's, check out the Telegraph's Hostages 1 Year On project, where we've interviewed 5 family members who've been on different journeys over the past year. Now, the last person you're going to hear from is Joel Carmel. A former IDF soldier and a British-Israeli citizen, Joel served in both the West Bank and Gaza during previous conflicts. He now works as Advocacy Director for Breaking the Silence, which uses verified testimony from Israeli soldiers to expose the reality of occupation and military rule in the Palestinian territories. They've collected dozens of accounts from the war in Gaza since October 7th. He describes himself as an anti-occupation activist. I started by asking him to explain how Breaking the Silence works. So welcome to Battle Lines, Joel. Thank you for joining us. Maybe you could start by just explaining to our audience what Breaking the Silence is and why it's called that.
Yeah, so thank you first of all for having me. I've been working for this organization called Breaking the Silence for the last 5 years now. We're a group of former Israeli soldiers who served in the occupied territories, meaning the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. We started our work 20 years ago in 2004 during the Second Intifada, and throughout that time, we've been collecting testimonies from soldiers who have served in the occupied territories in order to try to shed light on what that means. What's the day-to-day of occupation? What does it look like? What are the kind of commands we get? What are the kind of interactions we have with Palestinians, with settlers, with other soldiers? And through that, we're trying to show what the price we're paying for occupation is as a society, as, neighbors to the Palestinians and occupiers to the Palestinians. And hopefully we want to end the occupation at the end, because we believe that it's a price that's terrible. It's not worth paying, and it's something that we really need to end.
And Breaking the Silence occupies a sort of special place in terms of Israeli resistance to the occupation. Most groups that campaign against this are sort of instantly smeared as lefties and dismissed by large portions of the public and the government. But because you guys are former soldiers, you're able to speak from a perspective of having seen it firsthand and from people who have served in the Israeli military. It's a very unique perspective that you guys bring to conflict analysis, isn't it?
Yeah, I think unfortunately it wouldn't be accurate to say that we are given a free pass because of the fact that we were soldiers. And actually, we've been very heavily criticized, not from the right place, I think, from people who want to just delegitimize us, discredit us, because it's unfortunate for them that there are people who actually did the work and saw the occupation with their own eyes, who have something to say about it, and it doesn't fit into their convenient narrative of, we need the occupation for our security. But I think, we've now, over the 20 years that we've existed, we've collected testimonies from over 1,400 soldiers. It's true to say that you can't get the whole picture from one person's perspective, but that's exactly why we're trying to, each testimony is like a piece of a puzzle. And it shows something about, from that person's perspective, about the nature of the occupation. And I think by putting all of those puzzle pieces together, we're able to see something about the bigger picture of what this looks like and why it needs to end.
So let's talk about some of those testimonies. As you say, you've been gathering them for 20 years. What has been different, or what changes have you noticed, or what similarities, I suppose, have you noticed about the testimonies that you've collected from soldiers who've served in Gaza over the last year since the horrors of October 7th?
Well, unfortunately, it's what we're seeing over the last year isn't new, in the sense that a lot of the way we've been fighting in Gaza has been based on the same doctrines that we've been employing for many years now. We actually put out quite a big publication after the 2008-2009 war in Gaza, and then another one after the 2014 war in Gaza, which were collections of testimonies from soldiers who fought at the time. And unfortunately, what we've seen in this war is that we're basically using the same kind of strategy, the same kind of directives, and yet this time it's just on a huge scale. And there's something about that moment of the 7th of October which was so traumatic for us as a society. And I think we're a small country, so there's really not a single person here who wasn't in some way either directly affected by the horrors of the 7th of October or knows someone who was killed or was kidnapped or was injured or had to hide in a bunker for however many hours on that day. And I think that trauma is being kind of used and abused and exploited in order to fight this war, which is really brought out a very ugly side of our society. But that's really translated into the kinds of things that we've seen in the army and the way we fought this war. Maybe I can go into a bit more detail about that.
If you could give us some examples of the sorts of things that you've been hearing in the testimonies.
Yeah, so maybe I can say about the main doctrines that have guided us in previous wars, but in this war all the more so. The first doctrine is what we call the Dakhia doctrine. Actually, Dakhia has been in the headlines a lot more in the last few days because it's obviously a kind of a suburb of Beirut in Lebanon, and it's a doctrine that came out of the 2006 war, which Israel fought with Hezbollah. And the doctrine basically says that because we are fighting a non-conventional enemy, right? It's not the kind of old style wars where the end game was to put your flag in the enemy's territory, but rather, this is a terrorist organization and obliterating them completely. So the idea of this kind of war, this new warfare, is essentially to just distance this current war operation from the next one and try to create as much distance as possible. And the way we've been doing that is by specifically targeting civilian infrastructure, right? Because what we want is to, on the one hand, make sure that the terrorist organization that we're fighting, and in this case it's Hamas, after the war, they have to rearm, right? They'll have to concentrate their efforts more on rebuilding the civilian infrastructure and the neighborhoods where they've hidden their fighters. And on the other hand, what we're trying to do is to convince the civilian population that it's not worth hiding Hamas people in their midst. So that was the idea. It seems like it hasn't worked at all, but the price that everyone is paying for that, particularly the people living in these areas, is that we're targeting really neighborhoods. We're targeting. You can see I think there's no longer any higher education institution in Gaza today, right? Because we've blown up all of the universities. We've gone for the Palestinian Parliament building in Gaza City, the Palestine Square, right? These very important symbolic images to try to convince the civilian population that we're the victors of this war and that Hamas isn't able to defend them. So that's one thing. The other side of this is a doctrine that we call zero casualties to our soldiers. And zero casualties to our soldiers basically means that we are willing to do anything and everything it takes in order not to put our soldiers at any kind of risk. Now, maybe not when I was in the army, but a few years before that, so maybe 15 years ago, there was this saying in the army which means if there's any doubt, then there's no doubt. Meaning that if there's any doubt that if you're when you shoot, you might possibly hit someone, then don't shoot. And in this war, but also in the previous wars, but now a lot more so, we've basically turned that formula on its head. And we've started saying, im yesafek en safek, meaning if there's any doubt that one of our soldiers, will be in any way hurt, then there's no doubt, shoot, right? And the way that's been expressed is, you can see in the massive amount of firepower that's been used in this war. You can see the fact that we go in before we send in our infantry, before we send in any kind of ground troops, we start by an aerial bombing campaign, right? And then we have an artillery campaign. We've basically flattened entire, I don't know if it's neighborhoods, but entire areas. And just in order to make sure that there's no chance that the soldiers that we send in will in any way be affected. Now, I am Israeli. I know a lot of people who are soldiers in this war, right? Because there's been a huge amount of reservists sent in. And I don't want those soldiers to be hurt either. I don't want anyone to be hurt. But it is important to point out that this is exactly the point of international humanitarian law, right? The rules of war, which basically say that wars are supposed to be fought between combatants. That was the reason that after the world wars, the countries got together and said, we can't do this anymore with these huge numbers of civilian casualties. We need to make sure that wars are fought between combatants. And that's why civilians are supposed to be outside of the game. And the way we've been fighting has basically turned that on its head. And that's how we got to the situation where we have more than 40,000 people in Gaza killed today.
What has your work taught you about how the Israeli army likes to portray itself? Obviously, there's a massive propaganda war underway, as well as the actual on-the-ground war. One of the phrases that you hear the most is the most moral army in the world. Self-defense often usually invoked as well. What have you learned about the IDF over the last year in the way that they've been operating in Gaza?
Well, I mean, we have this phrase or this mindset of being the most moral army in the world, and that's something I think is very interesting. That's the thing that we like to take pride in, being moral, and I think it says something about the values that are dear to us as a society, as an Israeli society, as a Jewish society. Unfortunately, we're not able to live up to those values, and I think that there's been kind of this shift over over many years now, and that's something that the occupation has done to us. We on the left have been talking for years now about the occupation corrupting, but the shift, especially over the last year since the 7th of October, has been that I think that we're not even talking about morality so much anymore. And morality is something that definitely on the right is used as a way of saying, look, we can't be weak. And all of this talk about trying to be moral has brought us to where we were today, to the 7th of October, and that kind of weakness is what brought us on our knees. I completely dispute that narrative, and I think that the narrative now that we need to avenge the deaths of those who were killed on the 7th of October, and really this kind of revenge narrative that's taken hold since the 7th of October has been very dominant. I think that's really what's dangerous for us, because what we've ended up doing is fighting this war, which has been guided by the need for revenge, but doesn't have any proper goals, right? From the very beginning, we've been demanding of our government some kind of understanding of what we want to see and what the government wants to see in Gaza on the day after the end of the war. And there has not been any such discussion, only some very vague things. And if anything, there are things that are very concrete, like bringing home our hostages or eliminating Hamas, which itself it's quite vague. But we've not been doing either of those things. What we've ended up doing, and this is something that I think we're very afraid of, is reestablishing permanent presence inside the Gaza Strip, which will end up meaning, a direct long-term occupation inside Gaza, just like we had for many years before 2005, and then continued in a kind of different form after 2005. But that's very bad for us, because basically you're sending soldiers forever or for indefinitely to kill and to be killed for no good reason.
And just finally, are you hopeful for any kind of resolution in the short, medium, long term? Breaking the Silence has been working for a long time, and yet Israeli opinion doesn't seem to be shifting. Is that fair to say? Do you feel like you've had success? Are you hopeful for success in the future?
Well, I don't think I'd be in the work that I'm in if I didn't have hope, because I really believe that there's always a chance to change things, and there are opportunities. I think in this moment, although it's very dark and we're now, I don't know if on the brink of or already quite deep into another war on our northern front, but I think I can see this kind of light at the end of the tunnel through the hostage issue. Now, I personally know one of the hostages, Oded Lifshitz, who was kidnapped from Kibbutz Nir Oz. He's 84 years old now. So this issue is very close to my heart. But I think for many Israelis, this feeling of, if this war is being fought supposedly for our security, then what kind of security do we get, or the feeling of security, which is maybe just as important, do we get when we have a government which is willing to allow our fellow civilians or residents of our country to be kidnapped, and then doesn't do everything in its power to bring them home? That's the worst thing for our security. And I think a lot of people have woken up to that kind of understanding. Maybe people who wouldn't necessarily have been politically active before are now starting to ask questions about this government, and generally speaking, many governments consecutively who have put more efforts into managing the conflict and basically upholding the occupation rather than actually keeping us safe. And I'm hoping that through that issue, people who are now out on the streets and demanding a hostage deal that will bring hostages home, that could be kind of the key to creating something different here. I'm hoping in the immediate term, that would mean bringing home the hostages and getting to a ceasefire. But that could also be the key to ending the hostilities in the north of Israel with Hezbollah, and potentially something different in this region as well, because I think that everyone here has understood in one way or another that we can't carry on like this. And I think that that slogan of we can't go back to the 6th of October, which everyone has been saying in Israel, it should mean something. And it should mean that we can't carry on just kind of managing the conflict without actually doing the work to try to bring it to an end.
That's all for Battle Lines this time. Please join us again next week for more of the Telegraph's best foreign reporting. Goodbye. Battle Lines is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our news, analysis, and dispatches from around the world, subscribe to The Telegraph or sign up to Dispatches, which brings stories from our award-winning correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a live blog on our website where you can follow updates on Israel and Gaza as they come in throughout the day, including insight from contributors to this podcast. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Battle Lines on your preferred podcast app, and if you have a moment, leave a review, as it really helps others find the show. As disinformation is a particular problem during conflict, we are relying on your support more than ever. Battle Lines is part of wider Telegraph foreign coverage in our podcasts. If you're interested in finding out more about the war in Ukraine, you can listen to our sister podcast, Ukraine the Latest. Battle Lines is produced by David Degahi, and the executive producers are David Knowles and Louisa Wells.